Good afternoon. My name is Ben Wisneberg, and welcome to Scribbler, my booktube channel, in which I read, basically just read my stories, original stuff, so that way I don't get into any trouble. Usually I have a guest reader, but apparently he wasn't able to make it today, so I have to extend my regrets and my apologies for Mr. Jeremy Irons, who was unable to be here today. So I'll have to fill in for him myself. But that's okay. It's all right. He'll be here eventually. So, this is Chapter 8 of my novella, The Bashful Courtesan. It takes place in Vienna in 1914. And so, without further ado, maybe we should get the ball rolling. Here we go. George brought Anna to the studio every other week over the winter months. I was left on my own and suffered as I always do during the famine I call winter. I lived by my wits through most of the season, eating once a day and sometimes missing a day now and again. I trade portraits for food and built up credit so that my debts are sometimes overwhelming, yet I always manage to pay them off once the spring and summer months return along with my clients. It was a long, hard winter all the same, with the wind blowing bitter and bleak and seeming to linger. The snow piled up in high drifts that covered the walkways, making it difficult for me to make the walk to the fountain around the corner. I had to chip at the ice in the cistern of the fountain with a spike, breaking off chunks I carried back home in a bucket. I'd put it on the stove to melt so that I might have drinking water for the next 2 days. But in due course, the cold, hard winter gave way to the rain, and if the rain proved relentless in its constancy, so what? It washed away the winter snows. Eventually the days grew longer and the rains receded, taking with it the memories of the cold and snow and limping into an April ripe with blossoms that dappled the hillsides, the morning mist clinging to the landscape like a shroud. Flowers were quick to bloom and the air came alive with the sounds of bird song, rather more melodic than the constant cawing of crows. Anna understood my need to take advantage of the light coming in through the skylights and did her best to comply with my needs. When I wondered out loud what sort of plants they had in the Holy Land or what a lion or leopard looked like, George brought picture books for me to look at. Anna made it a habit of bringing me food. She brought bacon, eggs, fresh bread, and coffee, links of sausage, different cheeses, and exotic spreads, such as marmalade and strawberry jam. George offered to walk to the fountain on the corner for me and bring water up, as Anna made lunch for the 3 of us. After eating, she'd clean the dishes and then pose on the divan after George left without having to prompt her. She sometimes laughed and said that she was getting fat with all the food she was eating, and George told her women like her didn't get fat. The proper word for it was Rubenesque, he said. "Why don't you stay and watch?" Anna asked George one afternoon. "I'm afraid I can't," he confessed. "I'm committed to Novak and the Countess." "Committed to Novak? I doubt if that's it at all," she said with a playful laugh. "I go out for lunch with them at least once a week," George declared. "How's that not committed?" "I'm sure you do," she said with a lingering smile. "But even so, it has nothing to do with either Novak or the Countess, does it? You're simply trying to ingratiate yourself with the princess. Don't try to deny it. I know all about it. I suppose Novak's told you I've been making a fool of myself. Haven't you?" "I suppose I have." He was silent for a moment as he picked up his bowler and gloves off the divan and began to put them on. "I've made myself available for violin lessons with Novak's boy, as well as the princess's son." "And why would you do that, if not to ingratiate yourself with the princess? How much do you expect expect a 4 and 6-year-old to learn? I was the same age when I started to play. Is Novak's boy a prodigy? Is the princess's son gifted as well? That has nothing to do with it. Are you sure about that? Novak says neither one of them has talent. Yes, it seems both children have taken after their father and uncle in that respect," he said as he left. "I believe the poor man's totally smitten with her," she said with a sigh as George closed the door. "And is that such a bad thing, to be smitten by someone you know you can never have?" I asked, and she looked at me for a long moment. as if she were considering the question, and then turned away, undoing the buttons of her dress. That afternoon, I noticed a large bruise on Anna's upper arm. There were 4 marks along the inside of her arm, looking suspiciously like fingers. At first sight of it, I said nothing. I told myself I wasn't in a position to question her about it, but I was concerned all the same, and rightfully, I told myself. Over the course of the last 3 weeks, I'd noticed several bruises on her body, and even though she'd always have a ready excuse or a handy story explaining them, she told me not to give them another thought. They were never big or awkward marks, and they never really interfered with my sketches, but they were noticeable and disturbing with the memories they invoked. Surface bruising, she called it, another word for clumsiness. I'd seen marks on her arms and her thighs, her collarbone and chest. Why do you care so much about the bruises? Because if someone was as clumsy as you claim to be, they'd have broken bones, I said. I trip, I fall, I bruise myself. And that's all it is, I asked. A note of skepticism in my voice. What else would it be? I don't know. I thought, maybe someone might have done something to you. I said it softly and with some difficulty. The implication alone was enough to sever whatever unspoken connection we'd made over the course of the last weeks. I was taking a huge risk in all but accusing the Count of striking her, but there was a vulnerability in her that seemed willing to accept it as an approbation of his affection. That with her suffering through whatever rebukes he'd leveled against her, she would be gifted with further treasures of gold, diamonds, and silks. She refused to look at me or acknowledge what I'd said, dismissing the whole idea with a quick wave of her hand. I thought, if she's willing to put up with it, who am I to tell her any different? It's just that I knew the difference between the marks a simple bump in the night made, and, say, a slap or a punch, having endured so many myself as a child growing up. After the damp chill of early spring and the gentle rains of April drifted away, the sun came out, staying longer and longer each day and bringing with it the assurance of warm summer. There was the hum of insects and birds, as well as the scent of wildflowers and fresh-mown grass. The trees lining the boulevards gave into leaf, offering shade for late afternoon strollers. It seemed that whenever George arrived with Anna now, he'd only stay long enough to take Anna's wrap from her and hang it up. He'd look at the charcoal and water sketches I made the day before and ask me when I was going to start painting. I always gave him some excuse, telling him soon. He complained how I was always waiting for the right light or else looking for inspiration. I told him these things take time. Maybe you should stay and watch, Anna said with a smile. You could help come up with ideas for us. The fact of the matter is, Yevgeny hasn't started the painting because of me. Yevgeny is it, he said, and I felt myself blushing under the scrutiny of his gaze. I would have preferred the sanctity offered me by my smock, but George had a way of putting me at my ease, and I had long since put it aside. He offered me a cigarette as he lighted one for himself. He comes up with plenty of ideas, Anna went on to say, as though anything George might have implied meant little to her. It's just that nothing he suggested appeals to my sense of— What was that word you used, she asked me? Veneration. Yes, that one. Veneration. My sense of veneration. Your sense of veneration, George said with a smile. I'm not sure if that's the word I'd use. He offered to light my cigarette. I'll admit I'm more inclined to going along with his idea of being Cleopatra right now rather than his idea of David and the Queen of Sheba. But it doesn't matter what I choose. I always change my mind the next day. Yesterday, I thought being immortalized as the Queen of Sheba was what I wanted. Cleopatra, the Queen of Sheba, George said. George asked as he looked at me and tried to smile. Those are your choices? I'm glad to hear you're at least making an effort. It's a question of proper lighting, I said. With 10 hours of daylight, I can paint all day and not have to burn my candles at night. Help me make a decision, Anna said. I'm afraid Yevgeny is as impatient to get started as the Count. Novak's not impatient, George said. He understands that it was bad timing on his part to offer the commission when he did. with winter coming and all that. He's more curious than anything else. Then stay and help Yevgeny convince me. And what of my rehearsals with the maestro? Novak must have told you. I'm giving a recital for Ferdinand and Sophie. Yes, he told me, but that's not until the end of June. They're going to Sarajevo first. Novak's going as well, but it's May. In fact, May's only just begun. You've got plenty of time. It should only take a month to complete it once we get started. Wouldn't you like to watch? I still have to give the children their lessons, and that takes up 2 mornings a week. I've tried passing them off to a friend, but the Countess will not be swayed. It's probably a good thing for as far as my friend is concerned, because I doubt if he'd call me his friend once he met them. They're horrible children, but the Countess insists I be the one to teach them. You've only been with them for a few weeks. You can still have your 2 days a week with them if it's that important. But you can also practice here. Here? Why not? You're not even playing with the orchestra. That doesn't mean I don't need the maestro watching over me, he smiled. Which one is the maestro? The one who wrote the opera you're singing in? Opera, I said, somewhat confused. I turned to look at Anna. You're an opera singer? No, she's not an opera singer, George said quickly. Novak asked me to get her into the chorus, and I said I'd try. And did you? I asked Anna. She did, George said before Anna could say anything. God only knows how she managed to do it, though. Apparently, she doesn't even know the name of the man. His name's Strauss, by the way. Maybe you've heard of him. He's the one conducting the orchestra at the rehearsals. Is he the waltz king my mother used to talk about? No. That was Johann Strauss. He died about 10 years ago. This man's name is Richard Strauss. And before you even think to ask, no, he's not related. Is he as good as the other one? Better, I think, George smiled. But he doesn't say anything to you. I've watched him. He just sits there and listens. That's what he's supposed to do. He wrote the damn piece. All the more reason to practice here, if he's not going to do anything to help you, I mean. It's not called practicing. It's called a rehearsal, he corrected her. I'll concede that much if you agree to play for us, she smiled. And you don't think I'll be a distraction? She smiled again. Why? Will you be naked as well? She asked with a laugh. Please, all I'm asking for is a little bit of your time. That's not too much to ask for, is it? But I don't have any time to give you. So yes, it is too much to ask for. Who says you can't practice here? I told you. It's called rehearsing, he said again, only this time he smiled. Then, that's when I first understood how difficult it can be trying to talk to her. She has that way about her. When she talked to the greengrocer around the corner and he helped her pick out the best fruits and vegetables, she took them with a degree of suspicion, but only after having squeezed and smelled them. She waved another dismissive hand at him. And what are the lessons I'm giving Novak's son? He chose to ignore the gesture she made. Should I bring them here as well? Do you think he'd mind? How many times a week are you training them? Teaching them, he corrected her, slowly shaking his head. He's not an animal you train in a circus. He's a child. And suddenly you care for the welfare of Novak's child. The Count doesn't pay half as much attention to him as you do. I see that in the way he behaves. Is he a monster? Novak says he is. I don't think you're the one to say anything about behavior, he smiled. Please. All I'm asking is that you give us just a little bit of your time. It's not too much to ask, is it? And again, I don't have any time to give you, so yes, it is too much to ask for. Of course you have time. You can practice here. I told you. It's called rehearsing, he smiled again. Please, she smiled one more time and then laughed again. But you don't even like what I play. If you played it just for me, I might get to like it. All right, he said, holding his hands up in mock surrender. Once a week, with the two of you then. That's all I'm willing to commit. I'm sure Herr Strauss will understand. After 3 weeks of charcoal studies and water sketches, with more studies of plants and animals and more sketches of architecture, I was ready to begin what I hoped would be my masterpiece. I made the frame over a period of 3 nights, finally affixing the canvas as tight as possible and nailing it into place. I sized the painting in at 2 meters 4 by 3 meters 7, and when I was finished, stood it up in the center of the room where the ceiling allowed the most space. It had to lean in at an angle because I'd miscalculated. I'd taken my measurements for the height of the painting from the floor rather than the ceiling. The door had to be made larger in order to bring in the bigger pieces of scenery the studio had originally been intended for. George stood with his violin at the end of the room the day I first started to paint. Anna sat on the divan watching me. As George played a haunting lyrical melody that echoed through the room just as I'm sure it echoed through the streets, I laid brush to canvas and let myself be swept away by the gentle sounds of his violin. He was playing Paganini. He said Paganini was one of his favorites, as much to play as it was for him to listen, and oh, how he could play. I painted. I had a dozen watercolor sketches that I'd sorted through and tacked to the frame. I'd experimented with light and shadows in the sketches, creating a world of soft color and dark mystery, thinking I'd used the Chiracuso technique used so well by Rembrandt. I had to make the figures large, almost lifelike, not because the canvas was so large, but because I felt the subject was larger than life. I'd settled on Cleopatra. I worked the painting from back to front, laying down firm, confident brushstrokes, not so that they obscured everything, but dark enough to create a mystique. There were dark shadows hidden behind the huge Doric columns that caught the light, showcasing marbled veins and appearing cylindrical as I applied the last strokes of my brush. By the third day, Anna was seated beside me, enthralled by the creative process. "They look like they're round," she said, standing up and taking a closer look at the columns. "I thought that they would look flat. You have a great talent. I can see why Novak wanted you to paint this." I wasn't his ideal choice," I said. "George was the one who said I'd be the best choice. You didn't know that?" "I never asked," she said, turning to look at me with a smile. "He simply told me that he wanted a portrait of me and had an artist already picked out. He told me George would take care of everything." "Yes, he said the same thing. He said the same thing to me," I replied. "It looks as if George has been taken advantage of." "Why haven't you painted me in yet?" "In order to paint you in, I have to have a backdrop ready so that I don't have to go back later and fill in the open spaces around you. This way, I can simply paint over top of everything if need be, once it's dry, I mean." When it was time to paint the four main figures, I remember thinking I'd never felt as free to paint as I did at that moment. When I had the whole thing on canvas, and when the painting looked complete, I was ready to start the second stage, encaustic. That's when Anna stopped coming. I told myself that I needed to find a face or a figure, anything that I might put into the open left-hand corner of the painting. The space was simply too large for me to leave empty. For a moment, I considered using a reflection from either the pool or a looking glass. Perhaps she would look better holding it in her hand, I thought, as I was thinking how the figure had to be either a slave or maybe a priestess. I've always liked the challenge of painting reflections, whether it be in a water droplet or a shiny spoon. I could have easily used one of the many sketches I'd made of Anna, but that would have taken me away from the excuses I'd made to myself of going out into the public looking for her. And to compound matters and make it even worse, George was no longer making his regular visits to me, citing his rehearsals. It felt how just as I needed them most in my life, that I'd now been abandoned by two people who meant more to me than I'd ever imagined. I told myself it was another excuse for separating myself from the painter, another way of prolonging the process. I told myself that I needed to get away. I needed to clear my mind because my imagination had gotten the best of me, and my only thought was that something had happened to Anna. I made it a habit of carrying my satchel with me whenever I went out for a walk, the same habit I have to this very day, where I kept water paints and a sketch pad handy. Sometimes I walked for hours with nothing to show for it, while at others I returned home with endless studies and notes. I was hoping this would be one of my more productive walks. To say that my wanderings brought me to the opera house by chance would probably be a lie. I think it was more a matter of me walking there directly. It was a marvelous-looking structure built in the ancient Greek style modern architects seem to be using these days. A style they also used here in Paris, I might add. Of course, most of the buildings built in Vienna had false fronts and molded facades, which is of little significance because it's the overall effect it produces that matters most. I think it's what gives the city its fairy tale persona whenever people picture Vienna in their mind's eye. I still have the sketches tucked away somewhere. I can still remember how the sun slipped in and out of the clouds and in between the gilded domes and roofs of surrounding buildings. The marble and stucco fronts sparkled like jewelry in the staggering light. There were lengthening shadows in the open statuary lining the roofs, making the figures look like twisted fingers of a giant's hand. If a man can't find inspiration standing in front of a sight like that, he'll never succeed as an artist. I found a small alleyway where I set up my sketch pad and water paints across the street from the opera house. It was a place I'd used before to sketch patrons as they left the building. It was a moment before I saw George talking to the Count. They were standing off to the side, almost out of sight. I quickly made a water sketch of the Count dressed in his hussar's uniform, complete with gold-braided Austrian knots across the breast and down the sleeves of his powdered blue dolman jacket. He was wearing a small fur-lined pelisse, and on his left shoulder the small short-waisted overjacket that distinguished the hussars from the dragoons, and it hung off his shoulder as if it were a monkey on his back. His bright, high-waisted red trousers he wore also had small, ornate, gold Austrian knots braided in the front, and they were tucked into knee-high boots, Hessian boots. I could see his saber hanging loose at his side. In the crook of his left arm was his busby, a big black fur cone with a gold-emblazoned shield on the front of it. And as I sketched him, I thought that's what Count Rostov would have looked like had he survived war and peace. He had one foot on the bottom stair and his right arm resting on his knee as he smoked a cigarette and looked up at George. They stood beside the stage door, as if they were both waiting for someone. George was smoking a cigarette as well, his hat pushed back on his head. His red hair caught the splintered sunlight breaking around him. He was somewhat animated as he spoke. In fact, I'd never seen him as emotional, and I regretted that I'd been unable to get close enough to overhear their conversation. George's violin case was leaning against the steps, and he looked down at it once in a while, as though he had to reassure himself that it was still there. The stage door opened, and Anna stepped outside with several other women. They were all laughing, but stopped short when they saw the Count. Anna stood silent, wrapped in a hooded floor-length cape of green satin that gave her the appearance of a forest huntress. George was also suddenly silent as he watched Novak approach her, kissing the gloved hand she offered him. The other women let out catcalls, and Anna shushed them away. She smiled at George as he said something with that customary ease he seemed to have whenever he was around her. She laughed when he made to follow the women down the alley behind the building, but not before kissing her hand as well. I could hear her calling after him, her voice ringing with laughter as she ran forward to snatch up his violin case and hold on to it as though it were her hostage. George walked back as the Count quickly escorted Anna to his automobile in front of the building and sped away. Here had been an excellent opportunity for me to make endless sketches of the Count, I thought. I'd moved into the alley across the way and only managed to paint the single picture, however. I was more concerned with the man's profile, with his sharp, handsome features, but again let myself be distracted by the sight of Anna, so much so that even though I had a clear view of the Count, I'd failed to act upon it. Would I rue the day, I wondered as I stepped away from the small stairwell, knocking over a bottle as I stepped out of the alleyway? George heard it and looked up at the sudden noise. I looked up from the spinning bottle, and he caught sight of me, crossing the busy street. "Are you spying on us?" His voice was full of surprise. "What makes you say that?" I set the sketches the sketch down on the steps to dry. I spilled my bowl of water into the alleyway, wiping it clean and slipping it into my coat pocket. I carefully placed my book on the edge of my sketch in case the wind should carry it away. "Why are you here?" I tried explaining myself. "You're putting Novak in the painting?" George asked. "Yes," I said, looking up at him. I touched the sketch to make sure it was dry and slipped it into my sketch pad. And slipping it into my sketch pad, began walking the long walk home. "Did you ask him if he wanted to be in it?" "You were supposed to do that." "Me? You were supposed to ask him weeks ago. It was around the same time you asked me to put that woman in you're so fond of. Annette. Is that her name? You're putting Annette in as well?" "She's already in. Anna stood in for her. All I have to do is paint her face." "Do you have a portrait of her?" "Anna brought a photograph she took from Novak." "You can't put her in the painting." "Why not?" "You have to consider his wife." "His wife? I have to? You mean he has to, which he obviously doesn't. Why else would he have a mistress?" "You find the fact a married man has a mistress distressing? You don't?" "People have been doing it for years." "You mean that class of people have?" "Are you going back to your studio?" he asked a moment later. "I'd like to call it my home," I said. "Let me walk with you, unless you prefer to be alone." "Do you have a recital? Don't you have a recital to rehearse for?" "It's next week. If I'm not ready now, I'll never be." As he walked, George tried to make light conversation. I nodded, agreeing with everything he said. His recital for the Archduke and his wife was scheduled for after their return from the Balkans, Sarajevo and Destiny, to be more precise. I didn't care who was supposed to be there, but didn't say anything. It's a different world George and I live in. I decided to change the subject. "You know," I said, "if I didn't know any better, I'd say you and the Count were arguing. And you'd be right." "I would?" "Novak thinks he can use me as a blind for his affair with Anna." "I don't like to be used as a dupe," he smiled. "I don't understand." "The Countess saw the two of them together. The Countess and her sister saw them, I mean. And he told her that he was escorting Anna to my apartment. It was all innocent, he said, and anything she might have thought was wrong. And she believed him." He gave a short laugh, saying she was only too willing to believe him. "Now any chance I may have for the sister is non-existent." Excuse me. "She believed him," I said again in disbelief. "Why wouldn't she?" George laughed again. It was a short, mocking bark. I thought carefully before I said, "Has he ever hit her?" "Who? His wife or Anna?" George asked, after taking a moment to consider the question. "Does it matter? Both? Either? I don't know." "Forget I asked," I said, looking up at him. "He can be violent," George said. He didn't even pause to think about it. I thought he might let the subject drop. I was happy to leave it alone and regretted saying anything in the first place. He went on with his train of thought as if I wasn't even there. "I'm almost certain he's hit the Countess, but I wouldn't stake my career on it. It's something I overheard the two sisters talking about once. But he's Hungarian, and they all feel it's their right to discipline their wives. Not all of them, of course. I mean, not every Hungarian slaps his wife about. In fact, I'd say the percentage of those who do is very small. He just happens to be among that percentile." "And you think it's all right? To slap a woman?" "No." "And to have a mistress?" "My father had a mistress, and my mother knew it. But my father never hit his wife. Now, what did you see, or what do you think you saw?" "The painting." "It's a nude," I reminded him. "Sometimes I'd see bruises. When you've been beaten as many times as I have, you recognize certain signs others take for granted, like her hesitancy to explain things. She does everything she can to avoid talking about it. That's because she doesn't believe in her own lies anymore. It comes through in her voice, though, and her eyes. You can see it in her eyes? It's something you have to know before you can see it," I explained. "I just want you to be aware of it." "I am aware, but what am I supposed to do about it?" he asked. And there you go. That's the, and I'm sorry, I really stumbled a lot, and it's like I don't really want to have to do it again, because, like, that's a half an hour. Then I would stumble again, and like, anyways, so once again, my apologies for Mr. Jeremy Irons not being able here to read this. I'm sure he would have done a much better job. But anyways, I'm going to put this up, and then we'll see you again next week. Same bat time and the same bat channel. Okay, catch you later. Goodbye.